Hi, everybody. Let's talk about the Cold War. And this is the period coming out of World War II. Now, the book states that there are kind of three segments of the Cold War. I'm going to argue that there are two, but, that's kind of nitpicking and maybe being a little bit too, like I said, picky on what the author says. So if we look at chapter 8 in Reeves, coming out of World War II, we really stimulated the economy. Our nation income rose greatly. Our gross national product rose. And it was a prosperous time. We started to see housing, and this is when we kind of got into the cookie cutter houses that we see now. And there's nothing wrong with them. I live in a cookie cutter house. So when I mean a cookie cutter house, that means all the houses look the same, right? Anytime there's a new housing development, you always go and pick your plan and what you're going to have inside. But for the most part, some of the houses all look the same. And if you unfortunately live in a house with an HOA, that could be kind of strict. Homeowners Association. It's kind of a sore point with me. When I was living in a place, I decorated for Halloween. No, Christmas. It was Christmas, sorry. And I put lights on what was called a community bush. The bush didn't belong to me. So I had to pay a fine of $50. So, those kind of things. But, we started to see these housing developments come out. William Levitt opened up a place in New York called Levittown, which produced two-bedroom houses with kitchen appliances and a washing machine for about $7,000 a piece. I wish we could find suitable housing at $7,000 right now. But yeah, that became a boom. Critics would look at the look-alike houses, ticky-tack houses, but they were popular. And Levittown, which I believe is in Long Island, New York, contained over 17,000 homes. Also coming out of the war, a lot of people started to leave the military. And one of the incentives to go into the military was the GI Bill, and it still is. The GI Bill helps veterans with their education expenses, loans, and unemployment compensation. Nearly 8 million GIs took advantage of that, and our college population soared from 1.4 million to 3.2 million. And I know aspects of the GI Bill are still in effect today. I don't know the total specifics about it, but I do know if you join the military for a certain amount of time, they pay for school, or they set money aside for school. I'm pretty sure someone in the class could be a little bit more knowledgeable about the GI Bill. I just know the basics of it. President Truman, took over for FDR after his passing, instituted a program called the Fair Deal. And I have the Fair Deal linked up here on Wikipedia. Now, normally I wouldn't use Wikipedia for a source, but it's a pretty good kind of a synopsis of what the 21-point program was. And if you look at it, it was things like, fixing up our unemployment compensation system, which, is in the news now. Increasing aid to farmers, revising our tax system. So I don't expect you to know the whole 21 points, but just know that, they were for social welfare and economic development here in the United States at that time. There were some, pushback in Congress because people were worried that government was going to get big. And, it's always a concern for people on the right. Truman, during his time, we had high inflation and labor issues. Remember, inflation is the cost of goods and services increasing. So a good example of inflation would be 1 year that a gallon of milk is $1, then the next year a gallon of milk costs $2. The president's quick temper, kind of blunt speech, and often poor choice of advisors did not help his image. I think that kind of sounds a little bit familiar. It's making a joke. That's Truman, yeah. Truman was also an advocate of civil rights. He sought to protect voting. He sought to protect against lynching, and it's kind of disappointing that even now we still have to argue whether or not lynching should be a federal crime. And, it's obviously a hate crime, which is under the federal system, which we'll talk more about when we get to the courts. He also put, a commission on civil rights and a permanent federal employment protections commission. So anytime you work for the government, there's a lot of protections that you get as a worker, and a lot of the government, has to kind of be on point with what their hiring practices, as far as hiring minorities, women, the disabled, and even veterans. Truman also ordered desegregation of the military, and he established a commission that was responsible for ending discrimination in federal civil service. And like I said, I used to work for the county of San Diego, and there's a lot of measures that are put in place to prevent, discrimination. Now, I can't say it's foolproof. I didn't really work on that side, but I do know that there's a lot of measures put into place, like much what we discussed with the Pendleton Act, to prevent nepotism or to prevent favoritism in civil service. Now, the Cold War, coming out of World War II, the friendship with the Soviet Union was really short-lived. We had been at odds with them for a long time. American leaders had not forgiven the communists for pulling Russia out of World War I, attacking capitalism during our Depression, and forging a pact with Hitler in 1938. Soviet leaders contended that the Americans had tried to subvert the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 by sending troops into Russia. So, they had resentment among each other, and Soviet Union had a really strong commitment to communism, and we had a real strong commitment to democracy. So, kind of heads butting there, and started the Cold War. Soviets installed governments as part of the Warsaw Pact on the east side of Germany throughout 1946 and 1947, installed communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And Winston Churchill, in a speech in Missouri in 1946, declared that from Stettin in the Baltics to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. And that's where we get the term Iron Curtain. Basically, the separation between democracy and communism. Truman also had his own Truman Doctrine, where he asked for $400 in military aid and economic assistance for Greece and Turkey, establishing a doctrine that would guide U.S. diplomacy for the next 40 years, where we kind of feel it's our responsibility to make sure that communism doesn't grow. And maybe, we get into that neoconservative talk that should we as the United States be spreading democracy throughout the world? At the time, the U.S. had believed that the Soviet Union supported a Greek communist war effort, and, kind of worried that if the communists were successful in Greece, the Soviets would ultimately influence Greek policy. And we're going to talk about something called the domino theory, where if you believe one country is susceptible to falling to communism, then all the surrounding countries may also fall to communism. And we'll see that when we get into talking about Korea and Vietnam. Truman argued that a communist victory in the Greek Civil War would endanger the stability of Turkey, which was already, kind of a situation that we still have today in the Middle East. And Truman basically said it's the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. Basically what he's saying is we're trying to prevent the spread of communism. He also argued that the United States shouldn't stand by and should get involved in situations where the Soviets tried to expand their ideology. Anywhere the pro-American governments found themselves under communist attack, the U.S. would be obligated to step in, regardless of circumstances. So the National Security Act. And this was an act that started the Secretary of Defense's office, started the Department of Army, Navy, Air Force, and coordinated the activities of the national military establishment with other departments. And this was all in the name of protecting national security. George C. Marshall, had the Marshall Plan, which was a program which the United States gave large amounts of money to European countries to help them rebuild after World War II. And then if we talk about kind of this anti-communism effort at home, it dominated much of the activity during the Truman administration. He signed an executive order that created kind of a loyalty program for the executive branch to weed out communists and their sympathizers. And we'll take a look more at that. Inside the book, inside the Reese book, there's stories about the Rosenbergs and Algier Hiss. I'm not really going to go that in depth into that, but I do encourage you to, especially about the Rosenbergs, read up on their story and some of the things that happened during that time. The Marshall Plan sparked economic recovery. It restored the confidence of the European people. However, the Soviets viewed that as a plan to kind of subvert or interfere in their international affairs. And they refused to participate. The Soviets also prevented Poland and Czechoslovakia from taking part, even though they wanted to. This Marshall Plan also established the CIA. And the CIA was to advise the president on domestic, foreign, and military policy, and also to ensure cooperation between the various military and intelligence agencies, and also to weed out subversives or people that were sympathetic to communism. Now, the whole plan was to get the CIA to work together to coordinate with some other federal agencies. There's a program on, I don't know if it's still on Hulu, but it was a series called The Looming Tower. It's also a book. It's about kind of the efforts by a gentleman named Ali Sufran, who was an FBI agent, and kind of the difficulties working with the CIA with sharing information that ultimately led to 9/11. So I also kind of recommend that series. I think it's maybe 5 to 7 episodes, about an hour each. It's a pretty interesting documentary, or it's not a documentary. It's a movie or a TV show or a series. Okay, so the Korean War, the next war that we got into from 1950 to 53, began when North Korean communists crossed the 38th parallel, or the 38th latitude on Earth. I hope I'm saying that right. Latitude versus longitude. So we'll just say the 38th parallel, and invaded non-communist South Korea. Kim Il-sung, North Korea's army armed with Soviet tanks, overran South Korea, and the United States came to South Korea's aid again to stop the spread of communism. This was not considered a war. This was considered a police action. The whole invasion was a surprise to the Americans. It wasn't just a border dispute, but it was two unstable dictatorships on the other side of the globe that were clashing. And many feared that it would be the first step for a communist campaign to take over the world. President Truman said, if we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going to swallow up one after another. This is what I talked about when I talked about the domino theory. Right? Imagine setting up a bunch of dominoes like we used to as kids and flicking them so they all fall. The fight on the Korean Peninsula was a symbol of kind of the struggle between good and evil, East versus West, communism versus democracy. And our ultimate offensive was to liberate the North from communists. After more than 2 years of negotiation, the adversaries signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. An armistice is basically a word that says a peace treaty. And this peace treaty allowed the POWs to stay where they liked, drew a new boundary near the 30th parallel that gave South Korea 1,500 square miles of territory, and created a 2-mile wide demilitarized zone that still exists today. And I think when Trump met with Kim Jong-un, they met on the demilitarized zone. About 40,000 Americans died in action. About 10,000 were wounded. The war lasted 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. And we have a fun fact, and I got to bring this up because I used to watch this show as a kid, and I just recently bought it on iTunes. The whole 10 series is the whole 10 seasons of MASH, which was a popular TV show from 1972 to 1983 that talked about army doctors and some of the hijinks that they had. The show originally started out to be kind of a comedy, but it slowly evolved into being a drama toward the later years. But the fun fact was the show actually lasted longer than the actual war. And the last episode of MASH was the most watched episode on TV ever. So they rated it as the most viewed TV show ever. We also had a second Red Scare, according to the book. Publics versus spies, communist aggression, nuclear war, kind of combined with the willingness of politicians and their allies to exploit fears, produced a second Red Scare. Congress passed the McCarran Act, which was designed to cripple Communist Party and all communist fronts. The law contained, kind of an emergency detention measure authorizing the Attorney General to kind of detain anybody they might believe to be engaged in subversive activity. And I think when we look at those quotes on the PowerPoint, has reason to believe it does kind of create a broad kind of criteria for the Attorney General to be able to try to weed out subversives, if that makes sense. It's kind of a broad kind of statement where you might be able to fit anything into that. Joe McCarthy, a true believer, claimed that inside the State Department there was 205 communists and they knew their names. McCarthy was a demagogue, enjoying national popularity, kind of get people fired up. He was put in charge of the Committee of Government Operations that allowed him to expand investigations and tried to look for communist infiltration inside the federal government. He aggressively interrogated witnesses. Even though there was some lack of proof of subversion, more than 2,000 employees lost their jobs and also their reputations, which we need to kind of take a look at. Okay, so the book talks about the situations or the issues that we just talked about. So, I think it's safe to say that there is kind of two parts to the Cold War, and I'm not really sure the Cold War ever really ended, with some feelings toward, even after the Soviets Union was disbanded and it broke up into all these little independent states. So I'm not quite sure if the Cold War ever really ended. That's probably something more of a history person might be able to look at. But if we look at it from the political side, definitely there's some certain feelings that are still out there toward communism, even though we don't have many communist states. And whoever you believe our relations with Russia and some of the outlying countries, it's not really that great. Okay, guys, we'll go ahead and cut it there. We'll see you on the next lecture. I gotta stop stuttering.